So let's start. Welcome this morning to ABF and to our arrangement, the think tank Tiden, together with us at the Union to Union, former called LO-TCO Biståndsnämnd. I'm Kristina Henschen, the director, and I would like to warmly welcome you and our distinguished guests from far away. It is a pleasure to welcome you to the seminar on climate change and trade union strategies. This is actually a topic which has not been discussed enough yet here in Sweden. Maybe we have not seen the severe consequences yet here. It is about the climate change and the consequences for the workers all over the world, and most of all in the poor workers that we focus on at Union to Union. But without doubt, we know that the effects on the workers are already severe, and it will be even worse. As we speak, millions of workers are forced to migrate due to the change of the climate. And climate change causes violent conflicts, and in turn, conflicts lead to even worse, a worsening climate. It is a fact that not only the writer Naomi Klein, who is currently visiting Stockholm, is emphasizing. We will today discuss how the climate change affects the workers through extreme weather, distress, like typhoons, rising sea levels, and how the livelihoods are affected by millions when flooding occurs, when the earth becomes too salty for agriculture, and how many people are forced to migrate for survival. They are pushed into urban slum areas, into precarious work conditions, and into the informal economy. What we will hear today will make something very clear. We stand in front of one of the main challenges in our lifetime. The challenge to stand up for decent jobs and the needs for a fair transition and for climate justice. And to save our planet. And we can be the generation, we will be the last generation who can actually save our planet. And through the newly adopted Agenda 2030, we have already agreed to take urgent action to combat climate change and its impact. It is actually, although COP21, the climate negotiations in front of us, and the meeting in Paris very soon will take place, we have already agreed that this is what we have to do, and now we have to take action. So I look very much to discuss this in depth this morning, and it's a pleasure to introduce to you the speakers of today. We will meet Sabina Dewan from Just Jobs Network, based in Delhi in India. We will meet Kristian Skånberg, sustainability economist. We will meet Gemma Freedman and Jenny Luck, evaluators, and Annabel Rosemberg, policy officer of Occupational Health and Environment at the ITUC. And the person who will guide us through this process is Jesper Bengtsson from Tiden. And let's start. I'm happy to have you here. The floor is yours, Jesper.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you very much for asking me to moderate this conference. It's an interesting topic, and I think it's important that all parts of society, unions included, now evaluate how they can actually work different to be a part of the bigger strategy to actually improve the way we treat the climate. And it will be an interesting day, an interesting day before lunch. We will try to stop around 12, and then there is a gathering outside where you can have a sandwich and continue talking. There will not be very much time for questions. There will be some time for questions during the seminar, but not that much. So I guess we can, if you have questions and don't have the time to ask them, you can save them for afterwards and approach the speakers or just talk to each other about them afterwards. We will start with a film, 10 minutes long, about the climate change on livelihoods, and it will be shown here. And after that, Sabina Dewan will be with us on a link from New Delhi. Hopefully the link works. You never know about that, but we tested it before here and it seemed to be fine. But first the film.
Climate is one which we cannot change. Right? I think that is the greatest problem. And in tea, the basic requirement is the rainfall. Okay? And it is not the total rainfall. Now tea, say we grow tea here in Assam, we expect more than 1200 mm of annual rainfall. Now total rainfall is so important, but more important than the total rainfall is the distribution of rainfall. Now at that point of time, if the climate is adverse, I think that is the greatest problem. How can we expect that these big tea gardens having thousands of hectares of area can be irrigated? It is almost impossible. Commercially, you cannot depend upon only irrigation. Even the big companies may fail to do so. So actually when the rainfall was distributed evenly throughout the year, crop was also coming evenly. So this heavy crop in some season and very lean crop in some other season has caused a lot of problems for the management of the gardens. At the same time, this is also creating a lot of problems in the manufacturing units, because these units are made in such a way that crop would be coming in an even way. I can't keep today's crop for tomorrow, because tomorrow another lot of crop is coming. You see, tea industry is the only major agro industry in the state. Otherwise, Assam do not have much industries, right? Industries are very lacking here. That's why there is no employment opportunities mostly. A lot of people are being employed, either directly or indirectly, you know. So right now, more than 10 lakh people are being directly benefited from the tea industry, and another 10 lakh you can tell as indirectly benefited. So this is a huge workforce. For the last more than 150 years, the state is growing tea.
গত 10 বছরে যে বিগত এই 5-7 বছর আগে যে আইলাটা, আমার এই দুর্যোগ আমি চোখে দেখেছি। সেখানে অনেক ক্ষতিগ্রস্ত হয়েছিল, পানি ওঠে নাই, কিন্তু লোকালয় ধ্বংস হয়ে গিয়েছিল ঝড়ের তাণ্ডব লীলা। গাছগাছালা, ঘর বাড়ি সব ভেঙে চলে ধ্বংস হয়ে গিয়েছিল। সেটাও একটা মানে ফাটাল দুর্যোগ।
Well, in Bangladesh there are about, it's estimated by the Ministry of Agriculture, there's about 1 million hectares of land affected or impacted by salinity, which is soil salinity and water salinity. And that's a problem which occurs at its most extreme in the dry season, and particularly the hot dry season, from January through to about May. And then there's the results of cyclones. When we get a cyclone, not only does it rain a lot and the wind's very high, it actually pushes the seawater.
Nobody talked about climate change in 1990 in Bangladesh. That was not a subject that we discussed at all. You know, it was all about reductions in poverty. How are we going to do that? Population is increasing. We've got a big challenge on our hand. I left the country for 15 years. I come back. Everybody's talking about climate change. And salinity is a topic, is discussed almost every day in the papers, in discussions regarding the agricultural livelihoods of people that are living in the areas. And it is a challenge to find the types of jobs that they will be able to do outside of that.
এটা যে আমার আব্বার এই 7 বিঘে জমি উৎপাদন সেই আগের মতো রয়েছে। আমরা চেষ্টা করতেছি, বিভিন্ন দুর্যোগের কারণে আমরা সেগুলো পেরে উঠতেছি না। মাছের চাষের থেকে লোন নিয়ে মাছের চাষ করতেছি। যেমন আমি যখন প্রথম মাছের চাষ করছিলাম, আমি হয়তো সরকারি কোনো লোন নেই নাই, কিন্তু গ্রাম অনেক জায়গা হচ্ছে অনেক লাভের টাকা পাওয়া, এইগুলো নিয়ে করছিলাম। ওদের কাছে ওখানে মেরে খেয়ে গেছি, যার কারণে আমার একটা ইফেক্ট, আর সেটা শোধরাতে কিন্তু আমার অনেক সময় লেগে যায় আস্তে আস্তে। এরকম অনেক ফ্যামিলি আছে যে লোন নিয়েছে, মাছ চাষে ইনভেস্ট করছে, লস খেয়ে গেছে, দেউলে হয়ে গেছে, এরকম বহুত ফ্যামিলি আছে।
Although it takes only a couple of days for a cyclone event to occur, it can take 2 or 3 years, a lot longer, for farmers to recover from that. So farmers cope with those sorts of events in 2 different principal ways. One is actually just to leave that area and they migrate to cities and become rickshaw drivers and construction workers and may never return. Others stay there but have to find alternative work.
দেখবে যে আমি এখানে যখন কিছু হচ্ছে না, কিছু করতে পারছি, যে আমি শহরমুখী হয়ে যাই, সেখানে নানামুখী কাজ আছে। কিছু না হলেও একটা রিক্সা চালালেও তো 500 টাকা দিতে পারবে, কিন্তু এখানে তা পারবো না। গ্রামের মানুষ তো হেঁটে চলার পক্ষে হতে বেশি, কিন্তু শহরে তো 10 কদম গেলেই তো রিক্সায় যাবে। মানুষ শহরমুখী হয়ে এই কারণে গতন্তর আসলেই যখন আর কিছু করার না থাকে, তখন মানুষ কিন্তু পা বাড়ায় কিছু করার জন্য।
Saya ikut melaut dari tahun 99 sampai 2007. Udah sampai sekarang nggak pernah melaut. Saya pengen pindah ganti profesi lah, di darat lah. Masa saya di laut terus? Ya gitu aja. Pengen merantau sekali-kali. Nah sekali merantau saya jauh ke Arab tahun 2007 itu. Itu udah pasti kita dapat gaji. Kalau di laut sekarang nggak pasti, Mas. Saya ikut PJTKI dulu, ikut PJTKI. Iya banyak teman lah. Orang Filipina, orang Pakistan, terus orang Bangladesh, kayak gitu. Ya, ke sini kepengen perbaikan ekonomi sih ya, iya kan. Masih gitu-gitu aja ya, kurang untuk. Tapi ya di sana ya nggak berhasil, cuma buat makan aja.
Yang namanya kerja menangkap ikan itu tergantung pada angin, pada hujan, pada topan. Persoalan dari climate change, dari perubahan cuaca ini adalah panas menjadi makin ekstrim. Jadi kalau musim kering, keringnya ekstrim. Kalau musim hujan, hujannya juga ekstrim. Jadi kalau untuk ukuran daratan, itu kalau kering ya kering banget, kalau hujan ini kebanjiran. Kemudian datangnya panas dan hujan ini menjadi semakin tidak bisa diprediksi. Kalau bagi petani daratan ini kacau memang, karena sudah musim tanam jadi kacau kan. Nah di laut juga sama, karena nelayan juga tergantung.
Dulu waktu kecil saya itu kan, wah satu nelayan perahunya sampai penuh. Memang soal penangkapan ya beda jauh dari dulu. Dulu memang soal dapatnya banyak memang. Dapatnya satu perahu yang minimumnya 20 kilo, 50 kilo, paling nggak dapat. Sekarang apalagi kalau angin, terus hujan, itu tambah kalau ada petir, waduh paling ngeri.
In Indonesia especially, before the climate change, fishermen, they have knowledge when they have to go to ocean and they have special adaptation. But after the climate change, they don't have a pattern. So suddenly they have to change, look at other opportunity. If they went to Jakarta or to Bandung to involve in other job. Sometimes might become construction workers in some project, or maybe in transportation, becak driver, whatever that they can get some money for their livelihood.
Orang tidak lagi melihat bahwa bekerja di sektor penangkapan ikan laut bisa dipakai untuk menutup kebutuhan hidup mereka. Anak-anak nelayan itu kemungkinan sudah tidak mau jadi nelayan. Ada yang pengen jadi pegawai, ada yang pengen jadi pekerja di sektor industri, ada. Sehingga regenerasi populasi nelayan mengalami penyusutan. Global warming, pemanasan dunia itu mengingatkan bahwa kita ini cuma satu dunia, urusannya global. Jadi tidak bisa hanya dengan pindah ke sektor industri saja atau pindah ke negeri lain, ya sama saja.
কৃষি তো আসলে এমন একটা পেশা যে ও যুগ যুগ ধরে সবাই কিন্তু চাইবে যে কৃষি না থাকলে আপনি থাকবেন কি করে। কৃষির উপরে নির্ভর করেই তো আমাদের খাদ্য সংস্থান। কাউকে না কাউকে তো কৃষির প্রতি জড়ে থাকতে হবে। আমি কৃষি ছেড়ে দিলাম, আপনি দিলেন, আরেকজন দিল, এই খাদ্য সংস্থানের উপার্জনটা করবে কারা?
Okay. Some examples from the field of what is happening with the environment and its effects on labor markets. We also now have Sabina Dewan. Hello. The thing is, I'm just going to tell the audience here, the camera is there. So the reason why I'm going to look into the corner sometimes is because that's when I'm going to look her in the eyes. So hello. We saw, like I said, some examples here, and you have been working with this report. So could you please tell us a bit more about the report, its conclusions, and maybe a bit more about your organization, because I know it's not that familiar here in Sweden. Please.
Sure. Well, thank you so much for the opportunity. And it's really a pleasure, the miracles of technology, that I can be here all the way from New Delhi. I can be here with you all today. So I'd like to start by saying I'm very grateful to Union for the opportunity to work with you all on this project, and also to be able to be here with you all today. So thank you for that. My name is Sabina Dewan, and I'm the executive director of a think tank, a research organization called the Just Jobs Network. And the Just Jobs Network, we're relatively young. We're only 2 years old as an independent institution. But we conduct research on what I consider to be one of the most important questions of our time, which is, how do you create more and better jobs for people? So many of us spend so much time in our jobs. It's a source of dignity for us. It's a source of income. It's a source of livelihoods for us. And so I've made my work the world of work. That is what my organization does. And before I talk about what it is that this report that I believe you all have copies of, before I tell you about what this report says, I want to address why we, Union to Union and the Just Jobs Network, decided to address this subject. As we approach COP21, the meeting in Paris on climate change, one thing has become very apparent to me, and that is that most of the discussions at the global level are addressing issues like cap and trade. They're addressing issues like emissions targets and subsidies and potential opportunities for generating economic growth through developing the renewable energy sector. All of these are important discussions. But what I truly believe, and what Union to Union and our partners that we've been working with there believe, is that this dialogue neglects one of the most fundamental issues, which is, once again, what climate change means for real people, what climate change means for work, and the livelihoods of millions, even billions. And so, this is why we decided to jointly conduct this report, and the documentary that you just saw was a little taste of what it is like on the field and how people in the field are discussing these issues. Now, how does this dialogue or the impact of climate change in India, Indonesia, and Bangladesh relate or affect the lives of people in Sweden? Well, I think you all are acutely aware, much more than me, and I've been watching from afar, of the refugee crisis that's taking place, and the potential impact that the unfortunate events in Paris are going to have on the refugee crisis, and how Sweden is grappling with this very real challenge. Well, if by 2050 we are looking at adding 1 billion environmental migrants to the globe around the world, what does that mean for the globe? And what does that mean in terms of migration and refugees for all of us? So I wanted to really root my discussion on the fact that this is not some issue that is taking place across the globe. It is an issue that affects all of us. And it's a responsibility for all of us, particularly the union community, to hold policymakers accountable to address what this really means for the livelihoods of people. Because one of the major drivers of climate migration is the search for livelihoods. As climate change happens, it disrupts value chains, which are relevant to the private sector. It affects agricultural output, which affects what lands up on your table, and it affects workers in factories even, which are the sort of driving force behind what we have in our closets. And so there's a very real connection between what is happening out there in Bangladesh, in India, in Indonesia, and the rest of the globe. And I think that's the starting point. And what does that mean for livelihood? On the flip side of the negative impact of climate change is also the positive potential opportunity, which is the fact that climate change comes with an opportunity for innovation of creating millions of jobs that will be in the renewable energy sector that could facilitate the transition from dirty fossil fuels to more sustainable sources of energy. And the ITUC and ILO estimate that the potential of these green jobs could be as much as 60 million net jobs. So I think that, in order to be able to realize the potential opportunity, we also have to realize that there needs to be a policy agenda that is both national but also international, that pushes policymakers to recognize the potential impact that climate change has on jobs and livelihoods. And that's a very studied area. I also want to emphasize that the mobilization aspect and the role of trade unions is fundamental here. And I will emphasize this again at the end in a more concrete way, but it's fundamental here because we need to all be united. The workers need to be united, and we need an organization and mobilization strategy that pushes the policymakers to focus on how to mitigate the negative impacts of climate change on the jobs of real workers, to push the private sector to innovate, and come up with ways that they can offset some of the negative impacts in their value chains, and also to make sure that governments do have a policy agenda that does lead to the net creation of the 60 million jobs that the International Trade Union Confederation and the International Labor Organization have predicted are possible through adaptation to climate change. So unions have a fundamental role to play in pushing policymakers in that regard. So now I want to talk a little bit about our report and what does the report really talk about? Well, I'm not going to go into too much detail because you all have the report in front of you. But basically, we start the report with a very general discussion of what climate change means and how one might go about addressing it. And I'll come back to not addressing climate change, but addressing the negative impacts on livelihoods. And I'll come back to the recommendations later. But we look specifically at the case studies of Bangladesh, India, and Indonesia, which together constitute almost a quarter of the world's population. So what happens in these countries is fundamentally important to the global community, including all of you that clearly recognize the value of this subject. That's why you're at this event. Good choice. So you know, the idea is that we look at Bangladesh, which is very susceptible to floods, cyclones, salinity intrusion, which will eventually also lead to the shortage of drinking water. And the report lays out specifically sort of how some of these effects impact the labor markets in Bangladesh. And then we look at India, and we look at the Himalayan region, the Western Ghats, the northeastern region of the country, which you also saw in the documentary, so Assam and that whole region, as well as the coastal zone, and how climate change is most likely to affect these four regions of India. But the out-migration and the effect of climate change on these regions is likely to bear an adverse impact on the rest of the country as well, both through migration, but also, again, disrupting internal value chains and even political and social instability. So the report talks about these four regions and what can be expected in terms of the impact of climate change on these four regions. Finally, we look at Indonesia, which is the fourth most populated nation in the world. And 43% of the Indonesian population lives on less than $2 a day. This is 2011 data. And so you can imagine that as you disrupt sort of livelihoods of fishermen and so on, what this means in terms of affecting livelihoods. So we look at these three countries and we look at these particular types of climate change impacts in these particular regions in these three countries. And then we say, okay, what are the implications? So I'm just going to talk about four very quickly, and then I'm going to quickly talk about the recommendations. So first, what are the implications? One, as climate change happens, there is out-migration, which leads to overcrowding in cities and leads to a catalyzation of urbanization in these countries. So countries are already urbanizing, but when climate change happens, it actually speeds up both the process of migration as well as urbanization, except that it's very poorly managed urbanization. So a lot of these urban centers have no proper infrastructure to support in migration, particularly when it happens at the scale that climate change induces. They don't have proper governance. They certainly don't have drinking water or sanitation. And they also don't ultimately have enough jobs. So labor markets get saturated very quickly. They're unable to absorb the incoming migrants, which basically leads to poor working conditions, a lack of jobs, a growth of the informal sector, and a gross violation of workers' rights that are then exploited because the demand is so much less than the supply of workers. The second implication of climate change is on small and medium enterprises and the growth of small businesses, which are really an engine for employment generation. In many countries around the world, developed and developing, SMEs are the engine for employment. And through climate change, what ends up happening is that the disruption of climate change, disruption of agricultural sectors, the disruption of value chains ends up bearing a negative impact on SMEs that are less equipped to adapt. They don't have money to put towards mitigation and adaptation strategies. So generally, we find that SMEs tend to bear the brunt of climate change, and then because they are the engine of employment growth, that's often where the negative impact is felt. Finally, and I'm just drawing on 3 implications. There's many more in the report, and there's many more beyond that. But the major 3 that I wanted to talk about today is the poor and women in particular. Because ultimately, climate change affects the poor more than it does the wealthy, because the poor are more concentrated in the agricultural sector, which is one of the sectors that's most affected by climate change, and they have, again, less resources to be able to adapt. And particular women, because again, women not only constitute a large share of agricultural workforces in these sectors, but they are also often the ones that are on the low end of the activity spectrum. So one of the critiques, if I can critique, my organization's own work, is that this video actually doesn't fully explore the impact that climate change has on women. If you notice, especially in the Assam part of the video, the women are the ones that are picking the tea in the background, while the men are the ones that are running the businesses, that own the businesses and are talking about the businesses, right? But ultimately, what ends up happening is when climate change happens and you have uneven rainfall and uneven yields, sure, the business manager, owner is affected, but what is the bigger impact is the effect of the tea on the tea pickers, that are a majority of which are women. So we talk about that a little bit in the video, but that is one of the major impacts of climate change on livelihoods, is on the livelihoods of women in an environment, in an economy, in a society, a global society where women are already not on equal footing with men. So that is a point worth delineating and talking about in terms of one of the major implications that climate change will have. Another sort of harrowing realization on my part as we were doing this research was the understanding that when Bangladesh floods, women don't know how to swim because they're not taught how to swim. So, even something as sort of basic as like, okay, it's flooding and I need to learn how to swim to save my life, women get the short end of the stick. So again, disproportionately, the impact of climate change on livelihoods and in general is on women. So finally, I just want to quickly run through some of the recommendations that we have in this report. So as I mentioned that, as we go into COP21, the policymakers and the participants there are very much focused on discussions of cap and trade, how to curb emissions, and how countries should have equal emissions targets or have emissions targets to begin with, all of which are very important discussions. But there isn't enough discussion of the impact of climate change on jobs. So number one, we need to push for these discussions to have a separate track that discusses how to mitigate the impact of climate change on livelihoods, not just on the environment, but on livelihoods. And number two, how are we going to take these climate mitigation strategies and use them to realize the potential to create more jobs? So, as I mentioned, there is an opportunity here. And we've heard policymakers say that, yes, as we generate renewable energy sectors, there's an opportunity to create jobs. But we need them to focus on that and to realize that. And, I'll give you a quick example of India. There's a big push in India to realize the potential of the renewable energy sector, particularly in solar. And a lot of the discussion is around manufacturing. However, if you don't have skilled workers that are going to be able to provide for that sector, you're not going to be able to grow that sector. So, when we're talking about growing sectors like renewable energy and creating jobs, we also need to think about the supply side, which is how do you skill workers? How do you set up apprenticeships so that you can supply workers and realize the growth of these sectors that are likely to create jobs? Number three is social safety nets. So as climate migration happens, and again, as I mentioned, there could be up to 1 billion environmental migrants by 2050. As these workers migrate, they don't have the portability of social safety nets, right? Often social safety nets, if they exist at all, particularly in the developing world, are sometimes tied to their employers, or there's a very poor public infrastructure that provides social safety nets. Well, we need to think about that. We find that as migrants move to cities, they get disenfranchised, they have fewer rights, there is no real protection of migrant rights. So we need to think about both the protection of migrant rights and sort of social safety nets that are applicable to all. And here I think this is particularly pertinent to the union movement, because we, in our individual countries, whether it's India, the US, or Sweden, have our own union movements. And then we have these global federations like the ITUC and so on. Nonetheless, I think that there is really a lack of unity and consolidation in efforts across the globe that address issues like migrant worker rights, environmental migrant worker rights, and social safety nets in a more cohesive way. So we need to almost reinvent the global union movement and make sure that when we're talking about sort of climate change and climate migration, that we're talking about workers everywhere. Because the rights of workers anywhere, are relevant to workers everywhere. Number 4, I think there's a role for the private sector to potentially innovate and think about what the impact of climate change might be on their value chains and try to find innovative solutions, either sectors or industries to move into that could help mitigate the impact, and then also on how they might play a role in skilling for workers, skilling and apprenticeships for workers, particularly migrant workers. And unions, I think, again, have a very important role in holding the private sector accountable as they assume a bigger role in adaptation to climate change. And so finally, I just want to emphasize one last time the importance of the union movement in all of the recommendations that I've just given, in terms of holding the private sector accountable, in terms of holding the public sector accountable, in terms of coming up with a new model of industrial relations that is global in nature, that will protect the workers everywhere, and particularly the 1 billion climate migrants that we are likely to see by 2050. I'd be happy to take your questions if there's time. If not, our website is www.justjobsnetwork.org, and my name is Sabina Dewan at justjobsnetwork.org. And I'm happy to take your questions via email as well. So thank you so much for your attention. Appreciate it.
Thank you very much. Thank you. I think we have time for at least 1 or 2 questions. I want to start with one. You're talking about that there is a need for a more global union strategy, or so to say. Isn't it also a fact that many of the unions in the different countries are very focused on more traditional businesses and quite poor on working with migrant workers, for example? That's been a debate in Sweden for a long time. What's your view on that?
I think that's exactly right. I think it gets to a deeper issue, which is often we want our unions to represent the interests of the workers that are members in them at the local level or at the country level. You see this in the US, you see this globally, right? But I think the fundamental part of union strategy that is lacking is this understanding that when something happens, a disruption of the value chain happens in India or Bangladesh or Indonesia, when we are talking about 1 billion climate migrants coming in from these countries, the effect of that is on our workers here at home. And so we do have to represent the interests of workers there in order to be able to adequately protect the interests and the rights of our workers here in Sweden or in the US or in India, wherever that might be. And this is something I've worked very closely with the unions in the US on as well, because there is that sort of a little bit of a tunnel vision on, we have to protect our workers. But protecting our workers is increasingly dependent on protecting workers everywhere. And I think that's a fundamental point that needs to be incorporated into union strategy everywhere.
Tell me, what is unions which you cooperate with? What's the reaction when you talk about this? What kind of reactions have you had so far on the kind of conclusions you tell us about today?
Well, some better than others. I find that in the US, some of the unions that we work with there tend to be, it depends on the sector. If they believe that India or Bangladesh are taking their jobs, then it's not an easier discussion, as one might imagine. But then others are starting more and more to recognize that is the case. And so there is, it depends. Some unions are much more amenable to that discussion than others are.
Okay. One question from the audience. You need a microphone, so yeah, a short one, please. Yeah.
Hi, Ernst Hollander. I was working for the Swedish trade union movements long ago. I have one question and one little information. The Swedish union movement actually has been addressing global issues since the early 70s. Maybe not as well today, but traditionally there's, and this is the information, and that's important, I think. The second question is, the question deals with the 3 countries that you are discussing. Did they put anything about those questions into their country reports for COP21, and was there any consultation? Thank you.
Thank you. Okay.
Thank you. Excellent piece of information and question. On the information, I do want to say that I also think that the fact that Union to Union worked with us and supported our work on this topic is again a testament to the progressiveness of Swedish trade unions in addressing global issues. So I wish, I think that's worth noting. It's a point well taken, and I hope that this is an example that other unions globally can also follow in that regard. So thank you for that information, and I absolutely agree and appreciate that. With regards to the country plans, so it's really interesting that you bring that up, because we are actually in the process of updating the report that you have already in terms of bringing in the now released country plans and the extent to which they deal with livelihoods. The short answer is that they don't deal with livelihoods nearly as much as they should, and to the extent that they do, it's mostly in terms of job creation through transportation and the potential job creation of the renewable energy sector. But beyond that, there's nothing about climate migration, dealing with climate migration, dealing with worker rights, dealing with how urban infrastructure could better absorb climate migrants. So there's a lot of room in those plans and in policy agendas to bring in more of these issues.
Okay. Thank you very much. We will give the floor now to Kristian Skånberg, who's a sustainability economist, who will make some comments on this topic as well. And I think you will stay with us during this, right?
Yeah.
Okay,
yes,
excellent.
Thank you.
Thank you. So the floor is yours. Närmare micken. Du måste stå närmare micken.
Thank you, Sabina, for the report and the presentation, if you are still there. I was the one who reviewed the report earlier on, and I really liked it. And if Annabel is there, I will make you proud, saying nice things about you, and my best to Sharon. My name is Kristian Skånberg. I presently work half-time for the Forest and Wood and Graphical Union, GS. I also do some work for Stockholm Environmental Institute and others. And I have since 5 years worked fully or partly for the trade unions in the climate sustainability field. In the news today, there was reporting about too much rainfall in too little time in India. So this is not something that might happen, it happens every day somewhere. I am glad that Sabina brought up the same things I think is most important in the report. And the blackened pages was the thing that interested me the most. And it's about human mobility and migration. And one sheer number, circular migration presently in India, every year, 100 million people. And with climate change and population increases over time, it will increase. Compare that to the numbers we are discussing in Europe today. Just to put things in perspective. So I think the blackened pages, so read them and think about them. And then I'm going to discuss the key recommendation to put them into context. And it starts with the issue of climate change impact on employment must receive more international attention, and trade unions must play a central role. And remember the Arabic Spring, and now we are Nobel laureates actually with the Tunisian movement. We are 200 almost million people who are members, and with the families we are 1 billion people. And that means that sort of we know about these things earlier than anyone else. And that was the experience from the Arabic Spring. The first information came in through the global trade union movement. So when it comes to the testimony of what happens with climate change, it's our tentacles out in the world that can report that. And then it says, as a recommendation, more research is needed to understand climate change's impact on jobs and migration. And I don't think that so much more research is needed. I think we can listen to our members out there and what they live through and what they see and report that. So we can be the trade unions can be the channel. And that is in itself a research effort actually to bring in the information. And then it's the trade union representatives, people working with these issues who can sort of make the analysis and put that on the politicians' table. So we are part of a research movement, actually. Then a recommendation is new indicators on climate vulnerability can help guide resource allocation. And the maps that are shown in the report is some side of indicator. When half of the country of Bangladesh is flooded on a map, that's an indicator. And I'm a numbers person. I crunch numbers. And to me, it's the number of people, the population, and how much income or wealth is at risk when there are floods or droughts or sea level rise, and that's the important thing. And you mentioned livelihoods, and that number shouldn't be in money terms, because there could be a lot of value if the new London docksides, I think it's called. It's a little close to the sea level. And if that is flooded, it's a lot of money. But if the same area is flooded in Bangladesh, or it's not as much money, but it's more livelihoods at stake. So what is at risk for how many people? How much part of their income or wealth? Those kind of numbers, I think, should be the indicators. And it could also be how much area will be flooded or under sea level, and how will the productivity, for example, in agriculture be affected, and what are the means of adaptations we can sort of counteract that with. And with sea level rise, it's pretty hard to counteract it. One can do as the Netherlands do. You can build the walls and try to keep the sea on the outside. And the thing is, when you adapt to climate change, you have to think long term. You can't spend a lot of resources to save you from next flood. You have to think 10 or 20 or 30 years ahead and build the walls and your adaptations to be able to stand for climate change decades to come. So the thing to rebuild what is destroyed, yeah, you might have to do that, but when you rebuild it, it must be stronger, perhaps further from the sea level, and so on. So you have to, adaptation for climate change, you have to adapt with a long-time perspective. Then there is a recommendation. Government must pursue climate adaptation strategies that create jobs. If you read the synthesis report from IPCC, now for the Paris climate negotiation, the recommendations from the researcher is a long list of things you have to build or rebuild. And what is that? That is jobs. So we shouldn't be afraid of the recommendations that researchers say that climate change. It means jobs, different jobs than some of us have today, but these are jobs. So we should really, really put pressure on the politicians to come to an agreement, but not only do that, they have to make the investments that the researchers say is needed to mitigate and adapt to climate change. And then there is a recommendation, social safety nets are essential to protect workers displaced by climate change. That is just transition. And the word just is there for the sort of social safety net purpose. And that is needed to get a democratic support or social support for climate policies. People will be threatened, some will be losers, and then you have to help these people to be winners. And that will be through a just transition, a just one, with investment and policies that sort of help the losers to become winners. Because from the first, coal miners will not be winners. You have to make them energy workers instead. And there is another recommendation. Businesses should boost resilience of climate-affected sectors. And we have to work together with businesses and employers. We are all the victims of climate change if we don't mitigate and adapt. So we are in this together. So the old conflict between employers and employees has to sort of hide away. The employers and the employees have to pressure the politicians to take the nice decisions and then have to make the investments. After that, we can quarrel a little bit about the wage level, but we have to work together, even with the employers on this. Yeah. No. Now I'm going to tell you how important Annabel is. I have worked different levels with trade unions, and when I sort of came into this, and I come from climate research, more or less, I was pretty impressed, to my own surprise, by the work that the trade unions did, and especially on the international level. And I thought, oh, there must be a lot of people working with this. And it's Annabella.
But and she's not with us yet, okay. I think. So
I saw her on the sort of. Yeah. She is on Skype now.
She will join us in a couple of minutes.
I'll send her an email.
Yeah.
But the really important thing, I think, she has the leadership support. Sharon Barrows really believes this. So it's much easier to get some emphasis and pressure and impact if the interest for climate change and sustainability goes all the way to the top. People can be brilliant in the work, but the leaders have to sort of use the analysis and the reports that are written. And on the ITUC level, it is working. They are doing a great job. On the European level, they also have one person working with it. Formerly, it was Judith Curtin-Darling. She was brilliant. Now it's Benjamin Diniz. He's also brilliant. But the leadership is not really, they have other focuses. It's not that they think climate is unimportant, but they are not sort of themselves talking about the issue. On the Nordic side, we have the Council of Nordic Trade Unions, NFS. A couple of years ago, they were really working with these issues. And they had a conference in Ålesund, the 40-year-old Jubilee Congress, with the theme, resilience, even ecologically. And that was the whole two-day conference was on these issues. I thought that was really important, and I hope it sort of will live also in the future. On the Swedish level then, if you read the 300-page report up to the LO Congress, 4 times they mentioned the ecological sustainability issues are really important. And then there is one sentence more, and they end there. So they recognize that it's important, but we can't describe how or why or what should be done about it. But at least sort of they write it 4 times. If you go to the different LO trade unions, the transport workers actually do things even in Almedalen on this theme. I think it's really important. The building workers, mostly internationally, but they are discussing this and have it in their reports. I actually am employed by the Forestry, Wood and Graphical GS to do things about this. We have one report coming out about rainforest and climate. Pretty much part of Indonesia is part of that. Even part of India actually has some rainforest, but it's also Amazonas and the Congo Basin. And it's the same conclusion. Women, young people, migrants are the ones who are the most affected. And for the trade union movement, it's really important to bring these people in because it's the next generation of our members. So yes, we should protect present members, but we should also be aware that there will be new members and we have to bring them in. The Swedish municipal workers, Kommunal, is having a congress, and I think they're going to have a policy and strategy on environmental and sustainability issues. And if they don't change too much in it, it's going to be good. I know. I have met people from the retail side, Handelsanställdas, on conferences on sustainable consumption. And I meet people when I go to board meetings in the Prime Minister's office, Statsrådsberedningen, from IF Metall, even if they mostly protect energy issues and not discuss climate as such so much. When we come to TCO, they actually wrote 5 reports, pretty good ones, if I can say so, a couple of years ago. And we come to the trade union within TCO, the local government officers, with whom I think a few of you are here. They have the first certified union, and they have a strategy, and they have a policy, and they actually have a Congress decision to discuss green collective bargaining, to bring these issues into the heart of what trade unions work with, the clauses in the collective bargaining agreements. The civil servants, ST, have the booklet on a sustainable workplace. And then it comes to working groups, and could be sort of in LO, TCO, and SACO, where there is a strong identity in the professions. And I think it's easier, perhaps, to work internationally then. So when we come to health professions, Vårdförbundet, or teachers, de två lärarförbunden, they, in their international projects, I think they sort of feel that a teacher is a teacher wherever you are in the world, or a nurse is a nurse wherever you are in the world. And then if the international projects, people are affected by climate change, then climate change becomes important in the international work. So I think in the international sections of all unions, these issues are actually alive, but perhaps only in the international sections, not in the national ones. And then SACO, I have met people from the professional scientists, naturvetarna, and the graduate engineers on events. Otherwise, SACO is not, they're more on the individual side, not so much from the societal side, and the climate change, at least in Sweden so far, are on a societal issue. It's not hurting us individually yet. So the other thing I want to say, lastly, is when I go to different meetings about climate and sustainability, I meet a lot of business people, and I meet a lot of representatives from the employer organizations, branschorganisationerna, the other side, and I meet very, very few people from the trade unions. That scares me. On these meetings, the politicians listen to whatever are said, and the experts sort of say, oh, this is important, and the businesses and the employers think these issues are really important. It's their strategies. They're discussing what does the climate change impact our businesses or sectors for the next 10, 20 years. And if they are the only ones discussing this with the politicians, and we are not even there, we are in trouble. I think that politics, especially if we have a good agreement in Paris, this will be on the top of the agenda. How to the business industries where our jobs are will be evolving. And we have to be part of that. Not only because climate change is make people suffer in India, but because it will affect our jobs and our working life even here. These are extremely important issues. Thank you.
Okay, thanks. Stay for a second. Sabina, you listen to this. I think you're still with us here, right? We don't hear you now, but we'll soon hear you.
Sorry, yes, I am.
Yeah, good. What's your comment on this comment on the issue?
The comment of there were lots of comments.
Yeah, I know. But do you have any reflection?
Well, no, I sincerely appreciate you running through all of the recommendations of our report. And I mean, I don't, I particularly feel that that sort of the point with which you ended, coming from you, I think that means a lot. The fact that, as businesses evolve, as our economies and societies evolve, it's very important for us to understand the linkages between what's happening in other countries and at home. So I sincerely appreciate you running through the recommendations that we've made in our report. And I particularly appreciated your comments and your collaboration through the process. So thank you.
I was thinking, because Kristian talked a bit about the strategies in Sweden, and it sounded very much as if they were focused on how to limit the climate change in itself, not the effects of the actual climate change. Is that a reasonable description of how the unions and societies are tackling this?
I think the klimat- och sårbarhetsutredningen, there is a political process, partly in government, partly in the municipalities, the kommunerna, especially in southern part of Skåne, where we are actually losing land. Even in Sweden, the sea level rise, sort of the ocean eats areas. So there are a discussion about that, but that's bureaucracy. And it's not affecting jobs and threatening lives. Even if, and I think that was interesting. During the election year in Sweden last year, there was this forest fire for weeks. Gothenburg and Malmö, the two largest cities in Sweden, were flooded. And there was 3 storms, and I think people actually got killed, 1 or 2. So when the climate change, if you think that the strength and the intensity and how often they come, storms and floods and droughts, fires, are climate related, and researchers say they are, and I think they are. So there will be such events otherwise as well, but not as often and not as strengthy. And even that, the climate issue didn't come up into the election. So we still think that it's an international issue, and it is because mostly because of poverty. The poorer you are, the harder it is to adapt or move or take the measures needed. In Sweden, it's part of the future, but not so much part of the present and it should be, but it's not. And that means that we have to help politicians and employers and our own organizations to make it a present issue currently.
Okay, Sabina, you were starting to say something before. Just one final comment.
Yes, thank you so much. I absolutely agree with that, and I do think that you know, the emphasis on preventing climate change is very important, but I think that we need to move forward. We've missed that boat, right? Climate change is not just something that's out there in the future, it's actually happening here and now. And so while we simultaneously think about how can we prevent climate change from happening, which is rightly, as you mentioned, where these discussions are focused, we also need to now start thinking about how do we actually deal with the effects on livelihoods, because it's a reality. It's not something in the future that we can plan for 10, 20, 15, 50 years from now. It's now. It's the future is now. And so, we really need to, it's true that the current attention is mostly on how to mitigate and adapt to climate change in terms of strategies, but not so much on the impact of climate change on jobs. And that's where we also need to focus now.
Okay, thank you very much. It was very interesting to have you with us, and we're closing the link. It sounds a bit like I'm leading the Eurovision now, but we closed the link to India. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
And then I want to give the floor to the next point here on our agenda, and we will hear a bit about an evaluation report that has been written on how the union tackle these issues, and it's Gemma Freedman and Jenny Lack. Please enter the floor. And yes, the report has also been written by Anna-Karin Municio. That's right. So please give us a brief information on what the report is about.
So I'm Gemma Freedman. Here pouring the water we have Jenny Luck, and we're both British and have come from London. So let's not say anything about our airfares to get our pollution to get here. And then we have
Anna-Karin
Municio. Yes. So we were. First of all, we're delighted to be here, and it was very useful to hear Sabina's response and then your response from the trade union side, particularly from GS and your general knowledge. And we're sure that Annabella will have an awful lot to say and really great stuff to say in response. And I think it would have been interesting if she'd had the time to be able to hear Sabina's report. But of course, there's so much else to do. Thank you to Union for contracting us to undertake this really important piece of work. Also to the global union federations. For those, we understand that not everyone here comes from the trade union movement. For those that don't necessarily know so much about how we're structured, the global union federations are sectoral global bodies. So the education unions will affiliate to the Education International, the building and woodworkers and construction workers unions will affiliate up to the Building and Woodworkers International, and so on. There's 10 global union federations, so we thank them, and also the local unions who hosted us during our field visits, and to all of you today for coming. We'll try not to use too much jargon. We'll try and say the words out instead of the shorts. We're not going to focus on the methodology because there's no time, but if you have any questions, we'd be happy to answer those. So if we go to the first slide, please. This wasn't your normal run-of-the-mill kind of assessment, evaluation. It was an assessment evaluation. That means it's not focused on the OECD, the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development Assistance Committee's results-based evaluations, which talk a lot more about effectiveness and efficiency, combing through with a fine comb reports. Although we did quite a bit of that, but it wasn't as detailed as that in the way that the DAC results-based evaluations demand. The purpose was to identify and analyse policies, guidelines and strategies, to examine how those above contribute to individual organisations and the results, in particular how that helps to reduce poverty, to strengthen unions and workers' rights, and to identify and describe the good methodologies and good practice that is out there. The context of all of this within the development cooperation world is that it's reducing. The amount of donor funding, it's reducing. In the UK, I used to do very similar work to union. When our Conservative government came in, they cut all that funding. I'm now a freelance consultant still working with the movement that I love. It's happened at the same time in Canada, it's happened in Australia, and we know that there are very serious and difficult discussions going on right here in Sweden for the first time, and if somebody had suggested that to me a long while ago, I would probably have laughed. It will never happen in places like this. Well, we're in a very serious and tricky reality, so this has to be looked at within that context too. And finally, there is an increase in the decentralization of funding, moving to civil society organizations in the global south, and that's a good thing. But on the other hand, the way local organizations, the capacities they do or don't have, and this is very relevant to the trade union movement, where you might have small enterprise-based unions of 100 to 300 or 400 people, lots of little ones, or you might have large unions. Their capacities to take advantage of that funding that has been decentralized to the south and is no longer sometimes enabled through their partners in the north. That presents challenges. It presents opportunities, but it also presents challenges. So this is the kind of broad context in which we're looking at. So now we move on to the context itself of trade unions, climate change and the environment.
Okay, a fair bit was said by the previous two speakers, so I'm not going to cover those areas, but I do want to particularly cover one particular context that trade unions today have to work within. There's been an enormous rise in precarious work and increased exploitation to such an extent now that we have a definition of modern slavery, because the situation has become so extreme throughout the world and is happening also in our own countries. Trade unions today are under vicious attack throughout the world on their trade union rights and workers' conditions. It's a political, ideological attack, because trade unions have always provided a regulation and an opportunity for workers to have rights. And the attacks are on law and on freedom of association. The ILO Conventions 87 and 98 are not being enforced in many countries today. And without freedom of association, it is very, very difficult for unions to work. And this is the background and the context for unions becoming stakeholders in climate change and environmental issues. It's really not easy when you don't have the right to recognition and representation at a workplace to formulate a basic collective bargaining agreement. It's very difficult then to start asking to be recognised as a stakeholder in climate change and environmental issues. So sometimes it's not even seen as a union issue by many workers, because they haven't been able to relate the notion of climate change to the environmental degradation and the impact on them workers in their own workplaces. We talked about the impact in the global south has been talked about, so I won't you're all aware of that. And yes, unions are working in a context where there is loss of income, loss of jobs, and a serious loss of trade union rights. So it's not an easy area for trade unions to operate in. It's difficult to make it a priority in this situation because they have to concentrate on bread and butter issues of income and wages and fairness and justice. So I think that sort of describes the context with which unions are now having to work or trying to work on climate change and environmental issues. But on a more positive note, unions are doing a lot of work on this issue, and I'd like to also take us back a little bit, because unions were in the forefront of the struggle against pollution, of reducing the ozone layer many years ago. So they have been working on this issue. They have been working on chemicals, on environmental degradation, on pollution, on clean water, etc. for a long time. So it's not new to them, although I sometimes hear people say, oh, but trade unions don't know anything about it, and they never do any work on it. But they do, and they have been for a long time. So I think we must remember that. The concept of a just transition actually came from the trade union movement. It came from the Canadian trade union movement when they were dealing with a displacement of jobs due to the changing over of chemicals and pollutants. And it was coined there and has been taken up by the ITUC, the Global Union Federations, and even the UN and ILO have put it in their papers now as if it was their idea, but it wasn't. It's a trade union concept. And it's about fairness and it's about justice. And this is why it's so important, because there's going to be change. We're going to have significant change, but it must be done in a fair and just way so that we have rights as workers, we have trade union rights, and then we can do it in a way that protects welfare, protects income, and protects livelihoods. There's a lot. The unions have worked alongside the ILO in influencing the terminology, the new Sustainable Development Goals, and the 3 pillars of development being the economic, society, and the environment, which is putting it into a proper context. It's not just jobs. It's about, and I think our friend here mentioned it, it's about how we live, how we value what we do, how we value our society and our communities. They've also worked on the promotion of green jobs, and they're influencing the definition of green jobs, because there's lots of different definitions for green jobs. It's not an easy word. It sounds good, but is it going to be decent work? You have many green jobs which aren't decent, and you have many decent jobs which aren't green. So how do we define it? And this, then we have the notion of greenwashing, which is always there behind every environmental issue. Oh, we're green. Our Prime Minister, when he was elected in the beginning, said, I'm going to run the greenest government ever in the world. And now London has the highest pollution of any country in Europe, so I don't know what he's actually been doing. But we have to be aware of all that too. It's a complex issue, and it's confusing, and it uses terminology that drives us all mad or bores us to tears. So there's a lot we need to do to make it a bit more friendly. Unions have also been working on international framework agreements with companies and putting environmental and climate change issues into these framework agreements. For example, the French energy company EDF has pages and pages of how to deal with these issues in this international framework agreement, so it covers wherever they are. Supply chains, it's also an important issue in supply chains. We also influence trade union laws, and we do a lot of lobbying of governments to establish trade union rights within law, and this is absolutely essential if unions are going to become recognised stakeholders in this issue. So they're also working on the local levels, workplace levels, national levels, so there is a lot of work going on that trade unions are doing in these areas.
So now we move to the analysis of what it is we were actually doing within this evaluation.
Yes. So we started by, we wanted to look at the Swedish trade unions and see how do they work with the environmental area and how is it transferred in their international work. So do they have an environmental policy? What does it look like? What do they have any strategies to implement it? Is it transferred in their international work? And what are the main environmental issues in their sector? Next, please. So what we did was that we made a survey with the 22 trade unions that are affiliated to the what was once LO-TCO, now union to union, and we had some problems getting responses, but about 50% responded, and we also did some extra interviews, and we found out of the 14 that we did get information, 5 trade unions had environmental policies. Wait, no, sorry, go back, yeah. The trade unions that have an environmental policy are Byggnads, Lärarförbundet, Unionen, Vision and Vårdförbundet. So how do these policies look like? Next, please. Well, these policies are, apart from Byggnads, they are quite similar and brief, and they actually cover more internal work, like we need to how do we treat the waste management within the trade union? It's focusing on the internal work. How do the union work, the people, staff working at the union, how do they travel, you know, to reduce the ecological footprint of the union per se, and not focusing on the sectors where the union members working. One exception that we found is Byggnads, which also Kristian mentioned, which focuses on green jobs and climate-friendly building, which is the more external focus. Yes, please, next. But when you ask them, the unions about, you know, what are the environmental issues, main issues in your sectors, they clearly show that they have an environmental awareness and know clear what issues are important when it comes to climate change and environment. For instance, EF Metan saying sustainable development in relation to reducing industrial emissions. This is important, of course. And SECO, transportation, reducing greenhouse gas emissions in the transport sector. So you can clearly see that there is an awareness, and you understand it even if it's not reflected in the environmental policies. Yes, please. So are these issues transferred into the international work? Well, there are not that many projects where Swedish trade unions are involved that are working with climate change and environmental issues. There are a few examples. SECO, for instance, have a project working with building the capacity of unions to respond to climate change and transport. But the main priority, and also reflecting what Jenny was saying, is that the main focus is on organizing, on decent working conditions, and occupational health and safety. Yes, please, next. So how do they work? How are they involved in the international work, working with the global federations? Well, they are primarily active in design, follow-up, and evaluation of the projects. And as you may know, there are environmental analysis being carried out for each project. And the Swedish trade unions are part of doing the analysis, but the main party doing this analysis is the global federations. And the Swedish trade unions, no, sorry, go back, yeah. We have the environmental lens, which is a toolbox, you could say, which a method that helps you analyze programs, projects, organization from an environmental perspective. If you're interested in downloading it, you may Google on environmental lens and you will find it. But this is something that the Swedish trade unions, some of them are trained in this, but I think that there's much more focus that can be done. That is that there is room for improvement in mainstreaming and environment and climate change into the international work. But then again, the reasons for not doing this is that there are so many other issues that needs to be addressed first, like lack of organizing or insecure employment.
Thank you. Okay, so if we go to the next one, please. We also carried out a survey of the 10 global union federations, the sector global trade union organizations. We had a response of 7 out of 10. And we found that first of all, I should say, doing the survey was also part of an ability to triangulate our results and to provide us additional sources of information, because at times unions are not always very good at promoting the work it is that they do. So this was also a way of reaching in and finding out more. 7 out of 10, to a greater or lesser extent, have some form of policy on climate change in the environment. There was no trend, though, that we found in the approach. If there was a trend, it would be to say that they mostly integrated it into their core work. So whether it was on occupational health and safety, because if you think about it, workers, if they're suffering from having to use bad, dangerous, hazardous chemicals in the workplace, and that workplace also doesn't have any way to manage those chemicals safely, that goes into the environment. So the two go hand in hand. So as an integrated part of their work, and particularly looking at their sectoral work, that was probably the trend if there was, but there weren't any real clear trends apart from that very basic thing. There are two global union federations who have policies that are only focused on environment and climate change. Or indeed one which focuses just on climate change, the International Transport Federation. And then the BWI recently published one this year themselves as well. They're also organised in different ways, with different responsibilities lying with different officers. With some, it might be with the IUF that deals with agriculture, it might be with their Trade Agricultural Working Group. With others, it might be with the International Transport Federation, with an actual climate change working group. So again, it would also lie with different officers. Some might be health and safety and officers that have the responsibility. In other places, it's other people with other hats on. The global union federations themselves have a perception that the majority of their affiliated trade unions do not see climate change and environment specifically as a trade union issue. That's the perception. It's not a scientific. It was a thumb in the air. And then also the very few national employers recognise unions as climate change and environmental stakeholders. We're going to skip the next slide and go straight to the Global Union Federation policies. Okay, so BWI, Building Workers International. We decided to focus on 4 global union federations to highlight a little bit about their policies, because those are the 4 that recognise themselves. They have a huge contribution towards, or the workplaces in which they represent people have a huge contribution towards degrading of the environment and towards climate change. And they, in response, are doing, we found, possibly the most, arguably the most in response. So we focused on them also as our case study field visits, and so now we also thought it would make sense to highlight them with their policies. So Building Workers International, they're against all illegal and all unsustainable forms of logging. They've been working on this for decades now. It's not new to what they do at all. And they actively negotiate in many different fora for sustainable natural resource management. And these, of course, represent some of those workers that have come from maybe fishing that Sabina talked about and are now working within the forestry sector, or indeed the other side of it. Sabina mentioned construction workers. Many of those also may well have had to migrate into the cities, and so they also represent those types of workers. And on construction, BWI very much wants to focus on research for technology for sustainable construction that's longer lasting, that's easy to maintain, that's easily upgradable, and easy to dismantle and to reuse. And they're very engaged in different global fora. The UN RED Plus initiative, which tries to reduce greenhouse gas emissions from deforestation and forest degradation, in forestry certification for sustainable management, and in the UN habitat processes. The International Transport Federation, they recognise that industrialisation and privatisation of transport and in general, it is all very fossil fuel dependent, and that they and their members are a big part of that. In 2010, their Congress really was a seminal moment where some background work, which had been supported by Union to Union, assisted in coming up with their reduced, shift and improved framework, and also they had their first resolutions on this area. There's so much more behind it, but we can't go into it. They believe that fundamentally the global production system needs to be changed, and the supply chain system needs to be changed in order for us to stop what is going on, and start to claw back on some of this. They believe that we need to go from private forms of transport to public forms of transport. We know, particularly in the global south, there's very little public transport, so huge amounts of private vehicles creating massive congestion and pollution. From air travel to high-speed rail, and from road to rail and water freight. Thanks.
Okay, I'll talk briefly about industrials policy and the International Union of Food Workers policies. Industrial is the very large global union federation that affiliates unions in mining, manufacturing, etc., yeah, and textiles. They put their policy, they don't have a standalone policy, their environmental climate change policies are embedded in their policy on sustainable industrial policy. So it's climate change and environment is a key area of that policy. And all industrial policy recognises the role of the current economic ideology, or the role of neoliberal capitalism in creating and the worst impacts of climate change, and they recognise the political element of the issue. They also have a lot of emphasis on grassroots and grassroots mobilisation, and of integrating the issue into issues, using it as an organising tool, etc. And they believe also it can be used as what I termed entry-level cooperation, and it goes back to what Kristian said about the need to cooperate with employers. And it is a good topic. It's not as scary as wages and sort of hard monetary issues, and sometimes employers can be sort of fooled into believing that it's not actually going to cost them much, it's going to benefit, which it will benefit them if they get involved in it. So it's a different sort of issue than we've dealt with before in the trade union movement. The IUF does a lot of work on climate change in agriculture, pesticides, chemicals, monocropping, GM modified seeds, etc., etc., etc. And they very much link their issue with occupational health and safety. So they don't have a standalone policy, but they integrate it into the whole notion of health and safety, especially at the workplace level. Their policy also covers the very important issue of food security for the workers in agriculture, because often these workers, they grow food for us, which is shipped over so we can have vegetables all year round, but many of these workers are starving. They don't have access to growing their own foods anymore because of land degradation. And the other issue, of course, is water. The precious water is used for commercially grown crops, and often they're not allowed to access this water, and they have to dig deep into the groundwater, where the water is often poisoned. Also, IUF has worked on global pesticides. They have a global pesticide project which they've had for a long time, so that's an important part of their work. And they also are able to influence the policy debates on commercial agriculture, and they're strong stakeholders in this area.
Okay. So we'll now move to the 4 case studies. We looked at those 4 global union federations, and we tried to see where Union to Union had been supporting work with those global union federations, and where there was some kind of climate change and environment work that we could go and study. In Africa, it was very difficult to find just one country, so I ended up going to, it says Kenya, and in trying to do a find and replace thing, we've got UGA and A. It should be at Uganda. And so the first case study here is BWI. And what this illustrates is how BWI is integrating climate change and environment into their core union issues just kind of naturally. It just it happens consciously, yes, but it's also a natural thing. And with communities, but it also very importantly illustrates that there are really strong challenges to actually sustain any gains. So the first one is a China road and bridge operation in Kenya. There's a 500-kilometre railway which is being built, going through outstanding areas, beautiful areas of Kenya, with a lot of natural wildlife, and it's altering the directions in which the rivers are going. They're building pit latrines, toilets, and obviously there's a lot of destruction. So far, when I was there were 10,000 workers. The union, with assistance from Union to Union and other development cooperation from the trade union movement globally, has managed to recruit 6,000 workers so far. There will be 30,000 workers. So we can see the union movement's pretty much is keeping up very, very well with recruiting, and aims to carry that on. There's been a lot of work done on health and safety committees, getting those set up, and also in getting trained union representatives as the company health and safety officers, so that there's an integration there. There's also a collective bargaining agreement which is currently being negotiated that will cover the 30,000 workers. This is a 5-year project. So what happens in the construction industry, some of you already know, but for those that don't, a huge number of workers are employed for a fixed period of time. There's lots of training that happens. The union movement gains those as members. But then once that's finished, what happens to those members? It's a real challenge. So exit strategy, sustainability, how, all these kinds of things are really important. With Uganda, the Lafarge multinational company has a cement factory which has been devastating the workers' health, and also the community around them. All the dust from the cement production has been destroying the plants and really interfering with the sustainable livelihoods that they have to have for themselves, for their own crops, for their own sustenance. There was a union and community campaign with the company to ensure that there were dust recycling machines and to plant trees around the outside of the factory so that any remaining dust was caught on the leaves. Now, this union currently doesn't have an awful lot of support, and the membership that they did have in Tororo in Uganda was 250 previously out of 1,200. But now it's gone down because of casualisation of the workforce to 115, and also it just becomes more challenging for them to keep up, keep on the back of the company, to work collectively, because there's still a lot of problems from that one factory, but it's improved. Additionally to that, and it's a lot bigger than this one sentence, but the union has also established and maintained for a long number of years a forest, working with the local community that lives around that forest. There's a lot more that could be said, but I should move on.
Yeah, you probably have to speed it up a bit.
Yeah, sorry.
Okay, the industrial case studies, I'll do it very quickly. There's 3 little stories here. and both achieving successes in various ways. And I must say that the union-to-union projects, industrial projects, have really helped to support these projects. An organisation called Paradeep Phosphates. Paradeep is a huge industrial area in India where they make, one of the things they make is fertilisers, chemical fertilisers. In this particular company, the union had to struggle for recognition over many years. They finally won recognition and had negotiated a collective agreement and were recognised, improved conditions, etc. In 2008, there was a big typhoon that hit the area, and the area of land surrounding the factory was completely devastated. So the company decided, and talking with other stakeholders like the landowners and the unions, to actually turn this area into an eco-park, which they have now done. And they don't use GM seeds, they make their own, well, I don't know, you don't make them, do you? But you have your own seeds. And they're now doing research on changing over to organic fertilisers instead of chemical fertilisers. So, and they have put in the best pollution controls in this industrial estate. So this was done with the cooperation of the union, and they have provided ongoing training in ecological and environmental issues so that workers can actually use this training for promotion and for different career movements. So this is a success story, which is doing really well. The second one was a power station in Odisha, the same state, where they were causing a lot of pollution. So the union decided to have direct action and to go on strike and demonstrate. So for their pains, they were arrested, put in jail with no bail clauses. But through working with the other environmental NGOs, more notice was brought to the case, and what eventually happened was that they released them from prison and arrested the employers and put them in prison. And they were forced to then stop the pollution. That was also a success, but a different form of action. And then in the shipbreaking projects, which are probably one of the worst type of environmental working conditions of all industries, they used OHS as an organising tool and started through OHS to organise the workers and introduce environmental issues into the negotiations. And I think what these three case studies say is there's an understanding of climate change and environmental issues as both a political and industrial issue, that it has to be fought on all these areas. It needs union instructions and it needs collective action and mobilisation, which happened in all these three cases.
Okay, so number 3, and I really will whiz through it, the International Transport Federation. I think if you want to read more about it, it's in the report. But what this can show is, there can be a criticism that global projects that traverse many countries can be spread too thinly. But in this case, I would say that all the multiple different activities that had multiple knock-on effects has really brought it up on the agenda has really fast-tracked it and gained a lot of traction within the Global Union Federation. And highlighting that is that there's now the head of education now also has responsibility for climate change in the environment and some internal resources. I'm not going to say more because I know we're out of time.
The IUF was, there's 3 small case studies for agriculture workers, sugar manufacturing and tea plantations. And all these 3 cases are based on a grassroots participatory approach, which is very effective because they use local workers in organising and awareness raising. And the union, they pays them very little money, so it's very much about commitment and mobilisation, and it's very successful. The project actually assisted them develop a publication called Where Have All the Seasons Gone, which you heard about in the film. And this was done through participatory action-based research. So the actual research allowed the workers to make the link between what they knew was happening on one hand and what causes it. So this was a huge sort of broadening of their understanding, and it was been very successful. And I think they're also based on the fact that climate change and environmental issues can also improve working conditions because it's about chemicals and it's about what's used. It's also about gaining workers' trust and giving them reasons to commit to and mobilise towards these campaigns and providing them with accessible materials and education, and also using court cases and the law as well as part of their work.
Okay, so now we'll finally go on to findings and recommendations. So the first one is developing strategy and policy. I've already talked quite a bit on that. But yes, Gov policy does underpin other actions, and we did find a lack of enough, I would say, education and training on those policies that spread throughout. That's a resource issue. The recommendations is that, you know, it really needs to be research-based policy, and that needs to be then, you know, shared all the way through at different levels and breadths and depths of the movement. Through core activities, and that strategies need to be developed that enable representation, both within the unions themselves to have structures but, or methods of doing that, but also, of course, importantly at the workplace. And it's a fast-moving subject. Things happen quickly. So there needs to be regular updates provided.
Okay, the next area we thought was really important was gender equality and youth. And the findings recognised the different impacts on women is really important, but Sabina spoke about those. We were also, I noticed in the case studies, women are just amazing at developing practical solutions, which seem to bypass men. Women can work in the communities with people to raise awareness, and they're doing that now. Young people, it's their future, and they want to become aware and active in this issue, and it also can give them a lead into leadership development. Our recommendations are that gender is mainstreamed into climate change and environmental issues, all right? Because like it's mainstreamed into all other union issues, it has to be mainstreamed into this issue as well, and that is collecting statistics and disaggregating the statistics. And there needs to be equal numbers or proper representation of women in structures, in organising and in different parts of the union, as well as young people. Women and youth committees are good tools to strengthen women and youth involvement and should be used. And as I said before, utilising women's roles in the community is very important in these issues.
So then we go on to union project assessments, tools, and the environmental lens. Absolutely, it's been really useful that global union federations are asked to provide an environmental assessment when they are requesting funding and to report on it. But there are some areas which we've discussed already with union to union where there can be some improvement in that. The lens, the environmental lens, which has already been discussed, if you're a development practitioner, it's a very useful tool. If you're a development practitioner, the environmental lens is a very useful tool. But let's remember that most trade unionists come from the factory floor or from other workplaces upwards. So they're not development practitioners that are used to dealing with these different tools, and therefore we felt that there was a limited use for them. We felt that past approaches to implementing cross-cutting issues, so union to union, also require reference and analysis of HIV/AIDS, conflict, and gender within their applications, we felt that looking back at how global union federations had dealt with those in the past could provide some guidance. Maybe not, but it's worth looking at it. So recommendations to review the guidelines, to develop, maybe to incorporate into existing planning processes elements of the environmental lens, or to use that as a tool to make things more user-friendly, and to roll all of this out through regional and sub-regional level workshops.
Apologies for my phone. Nobody usually rings me, so of course they would choose it right now. Anyway, project resourcing, planning and reporting. We've written quite a lot about this, so I'm going to go through it very quickly. But in terms of resourcing, we'd like to really have recognised the GUF's human and financial resources that they add without recognition usually to these projects. It's quite considerable, and it would be very difficult for these projects to actually function without the material and political support that the GUFs give. We were also a bit concerned that we found that just adding in climate change and environmental issues, because it has to be added in, will have the impact of weakening other union priorities. And this, I think, we agree that this has to be discussed carefully, because if you look at the fact that unions need good structures, trade union rights, membership, organisation, in order to be able to gain recognition for CBAs and things like that, they also need that same structure to be able to introduce climate change and environmental issues. So this, I think, we decided needs to be factored in. We also found that there was inconsistency in the reporting formats and requirements within the reports that we looked at, and sometimes it was a bit confusing and very repetitive, that the people that wrote the reports were finding they had to repeat over and over again the same thing. Our recommendations that union to union and affiliates could source additional funding for climate change issues without taking away the very few and important funding for priority issues. So if climate change and environmental issues are a must, then there should be additional funding for it, and it should not take over the funding for setting the base for these important union priorities. That the GUF and union should have the discretion in selecting their priorities. If they selected the environment, great. If they don't, then there's a reason for it. So we recommend that the applications and report templates and questions that are asked are reviewed and made a little bit more simple and clear. And also, maybe one way is to actually link reporting to the actual project objectives rather than the broad scenario of what the broad policy of the global unions is.
So now to building alliances and networks. What we found was that what existed in terms of global union federations working externally with other organisations or internally is that they were limited in scope and frequency, but they can add great value. We found that Swedish unions were not appearing to work with the ILO or with Swedish NGOs on building those alliances and taking advantage of those opportunities. We were a little bit surprised, I guess, because we've seen a lot of that happening in the UK, that it's a different situation. So our recommendations really are around strengthening those areas more.
Organising representation education. I'm not going to say much about this except that participatory action-based research, participatory education methodologies are the most effective to use. This is a difficult topic. People must learn to articulate it, and participatory education provides that. So it should be used and encouraged. And the importance of collective of putting in clauses in CBAs as well as OH&S agreements. This is really important, collective bargaining agreements. We also noted in our recommendations that maybe there could be improved access to web-based information. Sometimes websites were difficult to dig out the information on climate change and the environment. Maybe that could be improved. And encourage and fund international participation, that unions, that global unions continue to do this for the international climate change events, because this is really a way of giving people, making people realise that they're not isolated in a field worrying about it, but it's part of a global problem.
So finally, the findings for Union to Union, we had a good meeting, as I already said, with them yesterday, so let's not dwell on this, but a really useful approach to raising the profile and the commitment to take action in this area. There does need to be a balanced and realistic climate change and evaluation policy within Union to Union, which could be developed in cooperation with the global union federations. And lastly, we started this report before the recent discussions about Swedish development aid, but for us, we felt that maybe CEDA could provide some additional funding to support it, because the workers it's a natural area of work. Climate change and environment. Even if the workers don't know they're doing it, they're often, making a really important contribution already. If you want them to do more, there needs to be some more support. I mean, it's realistic.
Okay, so to wrap up, first of all, apologies for going on so long. We have cut it down by at least 50%, if you like, our presentation. But I hope that you can enjoy reading the report. And apologies we don't speak Swedish. I feel very concerned that everybody's speaking English for us. I don't think at my age I could try and learn it, but anyway, so thank you for putting up with us and our English. Thanks to Union for giving us the opportunity for doing this evaluation, and I hope it's useful to all the global unions and to the union movement, and to give some ideas for working in the future. We learnt a lot, but there's a lot more to learn. And it's an ongoing subject, and there's always stuff to learn in climate change and environmental issues. And to just finally say that the attack on unions is relentless, and we must factor that in, and we must support unions in their efforts to get, to deal with exploitation, with violations, with lack of trade union rights. And climate change is the defining issue of our century. There's no doubt about that. And unions are playing and can play a really vital role. But they're working in a difficult, closing democratic space and need sustained support from you all. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And we are very late now, which means that we kind of have no time for questions from the floor. The report is very interesting, and actually it's in a way a toolbox, which I think we all in different ways can use in our work. Just one short question. When you did this evaluation, and you have a lot of recommendations, you have a lot of conclusions, is there like one conclusion that can sum it all up? Did you think was it good or bad? I mean, if you take it on a scale from 1 to 5, what would you give the union work now? Would you say it's sufficient, or would you say that the things you have studied?
I think there's always more we can do.
Yeah.
And I don't want to rate it as good or bad. I think the unions are doing what they can, as best they can, in really difficult situations. And I really strongly believe that. I mean, we hear all the time people knock the trade union movement. Oh, they're bad, they're corrupt, they're no good. But this is not true. This is media rubbish. All the time. It's part of the attack on trade unions. So any message that comes from this is we have to have trade unions. We're not democratic countries if we don't allow trade union rights. And this is the message I'd like to get over, that we must stop this. They're bad, they're wrong, they're hopeless. We've got to stop it. We cannot live without trade unions. Trade unions are a part of our society, and therefore, that we must support them. They must be there, and they can contribute a lot to climate change, but they are contributing to it now. So I'm not going to rate them. It's not my job to rate them.
No, as a journalist, it's probably my job to do it. So I wait with that for a while. Okay.
Can I just say
yes,
one thing?
Yes.
I think what I would say, and this is not to do down the Swedish trade unions that are here, but I would say that I was surprised not to see more engagement of the Swedish trade union movement
yes.
With industry and with government on your own internal things, just because in the UK they've been doing it quite a lot. That's not to say one's better than the other or anything. It was just, I was surprised.
And you also had this lack of cooperation with other NGOs, which I think is...
It happens a bit. It happens more in the UK, quite a lot more in the UK. I mean, but you know, in 2003, when I was starting working on all of this, we've come a long way in the UK. So it wasn't that long ago that we weren't doing brilliantly with NGOs.
Okay,
but
in India, they work a lot with NGOs. So
it's
patchy. It is happening.
Yeah, right.
Yeah,
right.
It is happening.
Thanks a lot. Annabel Rosemberg. Hello. Sorry for keeping you waiting. It's
no problem. I've
okay.
enjoyed a very good presentation, but folks, I have a little problem here, is that our power just cut off at the very moment I was supposed to start talking. So now I am actually talking with you with my cell phone, which is
really?
not the ideal situation.
I'm glad we have at least, you know, it's amazing to even have you here on the screen listening to you. You work for ITUC, International Trade Union Confederation, and you will talk a bit about the presentation we heard and also about the strategies for the unions now before the Paris meeting.
Yes, I mean it's a little bit tricky because after all the two presentations, I had the possibility to listen at least to some aspects of Sabina's presentation as well as to the colleagues just before. There are lots of things that could be said in reaction to it, and I've also asked to tell you a little bit of what we are doing on the ITUC side. So let me probably go quickly on some of the points that were. 1 second, guys, I'm in a conference call, please. Sorry, because now that the office is, I mean, you know, Paris these days is not the best place to be in. I mean, we are all a little bit, anxious about everything new happening, and now power is cut. And anyway, so you will understand that for us it's a little bit difficult, all this. So, no, I guess my proposal to you is just to go rather quickly on some of the key aspects in which we have been working, because several of them were addressed. I mean, they were addressed in the context of GAF work or others. And then maybe give you a few more thoughts on, of course, the importance of the climate meeting soon, but also a little bit of where do we see this agenda moving forward after that Paris moment, because I think that's also the question that is around this meeting. I mean, what we do as unions, what do we do on climate, on environment, I mean, in the future as well. So I guess for us, when we are, I'm in charge of occupational health and safety, environment, climate change, but I think for us, it's quite important to deal with each issue, not in isolation, but with its specificity, because the way in which unions relate to climate or to environmental issues more broadly, or to occupational health and safety, are not the same. Indeed, climate could be considered as an environmental issue, but from the very beginning in the ITUC, we have had an approach to it that is really not dealing with it as an environmental issue per se. I mean, it's an issue related to the economy, to the way in which we produce, we consume, we move, we acquire services, and therefore a union issue. And we actually made some effort to try to unenvironmentalize it, so that it's not seen as something just being put into the union movement as being a concern that should only belong to environmental groups. Of course, there are other issues that are probably could be considered more environmental and more environmentally related to workplaces in particular. Chemicals were mentioned, or other toxic substances. And those have a totally different treatment. And then separate again from other occupational health and safety issues that could be related to the way in which work is organized, and you probably know very well. So that's first, probably a first context element. My presentation is going to particularly focus on climate. Not to say that the others are not important, but basically to go a little bit more in depth on something. Otherwise, we tend to stay too general, and that makes all these presentations and conferences sometimes a little bit too repetitive. From our side, and I think on this we are not very different from what other unions might be saying on the issue, we are focusing on climate based on 3 key points. 1, this slogan, there are no jobs on another planet. I mean, we need to be very clear that if we are serious about our objectives of decent work for all, prosperity for all, and social protection for all, those will never, ever be achieved if we are in a world that warms more than 2 degrees or more in this century. It will not happen because science is telling us that the impacts are going to be so huge that you cannot even think about our rights being, or our expectations about income distribution or inequalities being addressed in a chaotic world as the one that we know we are going to confront if action is not taken urgently. So, one first point is that one, the fact that impacts are already being felt, and in the video you saw this morning, this was already clear. The second point was mentioned already this morning by Sabina, is the opportunities agenda. Of course, there are opportunities for growing jobs. We very much support the investments going in that direction, renewables, public transit, energy efficiency, and more. I mean, organic agriculture, recycling, the circular economy. But we also know that unions have a challenge there to ensure the working conditions of those jobs are much better, they are improved, but actually they can even become better than the traditional jobs we have now. And that will not happen by miracle. You all know, if you are in the union movement, that jobs do not improve just for the goodwill of employers. You need to enter in a negotiation with them and ensure that workers are organized so that they can claim for their rights. That's not necessarily the case today. Some of these jobs are correct, some are really bad. Basically, there is this this second element, so risks for jobs of climate impacts. The second one is opportunities for jobs, but also the challenge to ensure those are good quality ones. And the third one is the transition. I think we cannot hide on this. The union movement is expected to realize that if we are to leave 80% of fossil fuel reserves on the ground, as we need, if we want to stay in a 2-degree trajectory, as adopted in almost all international trade union congresses in the past few years, if we are to respect that threshold of 2 degrees, 80% of fossil fuel reserves must stay on the ground. And that means for us a hell lot of change in the world of work. And therefore the need to negotiate for our workers in all the sectors that are related to energy, so not only energy production, but across the chain, very good conditions and rights so that they can remain active, they can access to new and better jobs when needed, change within their companies or outside the companies when that's their situation. We need new skills, we need dialogue rights as well on the strategy for companies and the way forward. So this is what we call the just transition, and that's our third priority. So we have been working quite a bit on this for the past years, and I think it would have been useful, for example, in the study. I understand you concentrate on sectors, on gaps, but I think, in the ITUC, we started working on this issue some time ago, and I think we face some of the problems they are facing today, and I think that we are trying to solve them. So it could be interesting to make some sort of comparison, also because I think national centers are providing a good hub for lots of these discussions in many countries at this stage, when we are convinced that the sectoral angle is not sufficient to addressing this issue that cuts across the whole economy. We are convinced that energy issues, for example, do not belong to energy unions. Energy unions have a strong voice on energy, but energy is for all citizens and all workers engaged in some way or the other on energy use. So basically, national centers play a critical role in building a union position, maybe a confederal union position on issues where indeed sectoral voices are important, but we are convinced, again, not the only one to be heard. So we are working on awareness, very much. I think we cannot expect union and union people to make the link automatically to climate change, but once this link is explained, I think things come very naturally in their debates. We are building on international policy, and indeed international policy can be seen as something very abstract, but for us it's critical in getting union solidarity in place. I remember in the ITUC Congress in Berlin last year, we had a kind of important session on climate there. And of course, these concerns from workers, in particular in developed countries, was raised about what's going to happen to our jobs. These are good jobs, we don't want to lose them, etc. And there was a colleague, a union leader from Cook Islands, that say, hey guys, we very much understand your concerns. We are unions too, you know, but we are sinking. And I think at some point, we need also to be realistic on what this means for our fellow union colleagues in other countries. So I understand the terrible context for union organizing. We are facing it. We are struggling against it. We are campaigning against struggles for the union movement when it comes to the right to organize and others. But we cannot separate the struggles that way. There's not first priority struggles and second priority struggles. I think we need to, unfortunately, our world is complex, and we need to challenge ourselves on our capacity to integrate those different concerns in a more structured manner, keeping in mind our solidarity principles with our fellow colleagues in the South. We are also working on green jobs organizing, in particular in the renewable energy and recycling areas. The idea here is not ITUC to go and organize, is basically to try to bring together different experiences of unions around the world organizing in these sectors and trying to share them with unions that are seeing a growth of this sector in their country and say, hey, look, these are things we can do together. So the ITUC providing a platform from that share. And the fourth point is industrial transformation. We think we cannot talk climate without talking industrial transformation, and these both North and South. Industrialization is not something only workers in developed countries are concerned. Added value industries is something everyone wants, including in the South. So we think that if we want to be honest about what climate change and the battle against climate change might mean, we need to ensure there is coherence between our willingness to achieve industrial development that is sustainable and at the same time staying within planetary boundaries. So the ITUC is engaging with its affiliates and much more starting next year on this angle of work. How does this translate in the COP? You know very well, the COP probably, the COP 21 has been going on for 21 years. It's not a conference you just jump and say, oh, I have this brilliant idea. Would you please take it on board and put it in the document? It's not the way it works. And you know that. It's a long negotiation. We have been engaging in there for the past 10 years, at least. And the fact of the matter is that the meeting we are going to have in Paris in 2 weeks' time is quite crucial. The Climate Convention is a very good piece of international law, but it's very vague. The Kyoto Protocol that was signed right after the ratification of the convention left out. The US left itself out of that agreement, which meant that basically at that time, one of the biggest emitters and certainly one of the biggest historical emitters was not covered by the agreement. And we also know that in 20 years, the emission profiles of emerging economies has also changed. So there was a need for coming together with emission plans that were in correspondence, I guess, with the emission profiles of countries today and what the responsibilities and capacities are. So the Paris Agreement is basically about a new deal that is going to organize the way in which our societies plan change. That said, we are very far from having something sufficiently ambitious to stay within the 2 degrees threshold that I mentioned and is part of union policy. There is a discussion on what's the goal of that agreement. Is it 2 degrees? Or will governments just consider that there's no goal? We'll do our best and good luck. On this, I would just like to remind that the current pledges that have been put on the table by different governments before the Paris deal mean a 3.5 warming possibility. Basically that means that extinction of several countries already. In particular in the Pacific Islands, but not only, also half of Bangladesh. So extremely dense countries, as was mentioned this morning. So a disaster, an economic disaster as well. But the second issue that is also discussed is finance, because we know that developed countries in particular have to do much more than what is being pledged. This is actually the assessments that are being done show that. But we also know that the potential for emission reductions today it's also in the south. So we need to put climate finance available so that investments can go into those countries to reduce emissions. And again, on finance, the commitments that have been done to date, at least the 100 billion a year objective by 2020 is far from being fulfilled. So the Paris Agreement should at some point indicate what's the way forward on that issue as well. And the third big element of the Paris deal is, so we know what's on the table is not enough, so what's the process to make that ambition go up? And so there is a discussion on a revision or a review mechanism for the national pledges that are today on the table. On the union side, I think we are trying to stick with what our priorities and our reading of the climate agenda is. On the one side, we want ambition because we know that more ambition means more jobs, in particular in the short run. Today, the ITUC, for example, is assessing that the current EU targets are basically so low and so easy to achieve that will mean job losses in green sectors now, because basically it is even less than business as usual, what industry would have anyway even without the targets. So they are sending this signal that basically lack of ambition kills already the jobs of the future. The second element is on finance, and in particular focusing on vulnerable communities. The idea that climate finance, in particular for adapting to climate change, should not only go to big infrastructure, but also to sustaining social protection systems that are critical for ensuring resilience of citizens and workers. So making a strong link with our social protection agenda, that is quite key. And the third element is about workers, is about just transition, and the need to see strong references and a commitment to secure the jobs and livelihoods of workers in sectors that will change in the future agreement. Will this happen? Well, I guess we will judge on the paper. There are some elements that are not going to be too bad, but unfortunately we cannot bargain with temperature or physics. So it's very likely that what's going to come out of Paris is not going to put us on track. So I guess we will judge that outcome based on what we read in those final days in the conference. That's it. For us, Paris is not only about the agreement. I think it's also about our capacity as a union organization to mobilize workers and unions on this issue, use it for having some more leverage on explaining to you all, around the world, on why this issue is so critical for unions. And I think on that front, Paris is helping us a lot. It's helping us because it's on the media all the time, but unions are starting to wonder, hey, how do we relate with this issue, and realize that there are other union organizations and structures that are doing some of this work, that want to help. And so we find it quite, I'm fairly optimistic on our capacity to take the issue on board. That said, I'm not too nice with you guys. I think we are not doing what we need to do yet. Indeed, some interesting cases here, there, some local unions doing something, but the challenge is massive, and we need to do much more if we are going to be in the right side of history. I think the union movement will be judged by citizens on our capacity to stay on the right side, and I think we have not yet secured our part in that history yet. If I can, Chair, just a few reactions on what the colleagues have said before, and hopefully I will be able to engage with you a little bit more. So I would not like to make a too long presentation. I heard the concerns about the concept of green jobs, like saying, hey, green jobs, that presents problems. I think we need to take into account this concept in a historical perspective. 10 years ago, when I started this job, no one was making a link between jobs and environment. The only link possible was jobs against the environment. The concept of green jobs at that point in time was very useful because it was very clear on two words. You could see that there was a positive link between employment and the protection of the environment. Indeed, if we dig in that concept, we have different perceptions, different definitions, and it's true that on the statistical side, it might not be very useful, but I think from a communication standpoint, historically, it played a very important role.
Excuse me, very short finalization now, because I think we soon have to wrap this up.
Yes, I will probably just said that impacts are making unions in the South be much more aware of the challenges, and at the same time, the policies to tackle climate change, in particular in developed countries, are making consens in developed country unions stronger. So we see two dynamics going on, and these two need to come together on a much more, let's say, proactive role from the union movement to be able to sit at the table with the governments, with employers, and have our plan to how we think the world of work should look like in the next 15, 20 years.
Okay, thank you very much. And thank you for listening all the time before this, and for good comments. We are 20 minutes ahead of time now, or not ahead, after the schedule. So unfortunately, and it's been like we have all taken a bit too much time.
Not me.
I know. Sorry, not you. That's true. You were the one suffering from it. So we don't take any questions now, but you have time now, as I said, to stay a little bit after here and talk to each other and ask questions to the researchers who wrote the report we heard about earlier. Thank you very much for sharing this first part of the day with us. I think it's been very useful, and Kristina will say a few words in the end.
Well, I just want to congratulate you for taking part in this historic seminar. I think this actually shows that there are a lot of important work being done and ongoing, and we can do even better. And climate change is, of course, a trade union issue, and because we all realize that there are no jobs on a dead planet. Thank you for coming, and I hope you will stay to discuss strategies forward. Thank you to the presenters here, the evaluators, Gemma Freedman, Jenny Lack, and Anna-Karin Monicio. Thank you, Kristian Skånberg from the GS. Thank you to Sabina Dewan from Just Jobs Network, and Annabel Rosemberg from ITUC. I hope I didn't forget anyone. And thank you to Jesper Bengtsson from Tiden. This was co-organized with Tiden, the think tank Tiden. And last but not least, I want to thank my colleagues who've been working so hard to putting this together. Maybe you can just stand up and we will give you a hand. Tony, Johan is outside, Karin, Nina, who put the evaluation together, and all the others. Thank you to you for coming, and let's push this agenda to policymakers, to governments, and to show that you can count on the trade union movement. Thank you.